All right, welcome back, Bio 153 students. And we continue on looking at Chapter 23 on the respiratory system. Our focus now, we've already looked at the anatomy portion, but now we're going to take a look at the physiology. So this is Respiratory Physiology Part 1. So here we go. All right, so respiratory physiology, essentially it's breathing. So I wish I could say, well, it's breathing, inhale, exhale. Okay, you're good to go. All right, see you later. But no, there's a little bit more to it than just that. So starting off, just kind of looking at things very simplistically, we have our inhalation, also known as inspiration, so inhalation. And so that's referring to, of course, you take that very deep breath, right? And when you do that, take that deep breath, you're taking gases, like lots of oxygen flow, right into those lungs. And of course, the complete opposite part of ventilation is the exhale, the expiration. So first you take a deep breath, and then you blow out. Inhale, exhale. And when you exhale, the gases, of course, are leaving your lungs. So those are the two main parts. Of course, there's a lot of physiology involved there, which we'll get into very shortly. But again, this is just something subconsciously we do all the time, breathing. It could be doing our exercises in the morning. Or like we can see in this picture here, right? Maybe you're getting ready to do some yoga. A lot of people do that for de-stressing. So I've tried it once, but I wasn't very good at the yoga. But some of you guys might be amazing at it. So I just stick to running to distress. So inhale and exhale is a very important part, obviously, when it comes to breathing. All right, so when we think of the idea of breathing, we have to look at the changes in pressure that occurs when gases are coming in, air volume increasing or decreasing throughout the respiratory system. So the first type of pressure we're going to look at in here today is looking at atmospheric pressure. Okay, atmospheric pressure. And this is the pressure ultimately exerted by the air surrounding our body. So at sea level, that pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, okay? So that's approximately then what the atmospheric pressure is at sea level. So that's the case. We live in Michigan. We're at sea level. That's the atmospheric pressure. So that's the pressure throughout the air that we're actually breathing in. Outside in our yard, in our house, that's what that pressure is. Now, that pressure can vary, of course, based off of elevation. So that's going to vary if you're at a higher elevation. But again, here, we pretty much are at sea level in the greater Saginaw Valley area, and Michigan as a whole. All right, we're now going to take a look at this diagram here, and this gives us an idea of the different types of pressure, because pressure is a very important role player when it comes to breathing, when it comes to airflow and the volume of the air itself. So we'll take a look at that. So when you're breathing and you take that deep inhalation, the air that we have out in the atmosphere, again, that pressure is called atmospheric pressure. So that's the air that we're taking in, ultimately through the respiratory system. And that pressure, again, is 760. So that's something to consider, right? 760, like we saw in the previous slide. So 760 millimeters of mercury, mmHg. And so the air obviously goes down the trachea, the carina, and you get into the main bronchus, the secondary, the tertiary, etc. Eventually the air will make its way all the way down to the alveoli. And so we look at some of these other pressures that we have here. And one to take a look at is what's known as the intrapulmonary pressure. Intrapulmonary pressure. And this pressure is still going to be 760 millimeters of mercury. And this is the pressure in the alveoli. So remember, those are the smallest units ultimately when we think of the 23 orders of branching of the bronchial tree. And so this can fluctuate with breathing, again, when we have the inhalation and the exhalation. So that's the intrapulmonary pressure. The other type of pressure that we have is the intrapleural pressure. So the intrapleural pressure. Intrapleural pressure. You can notice this is different. This pressure is at 756 millimeters of mercury. This is the pressure that we find in the pleural cavity. And that fluctuates with breathing as well. So we can see that here, intrapleural pressure is going to be this vicinity in here in the gray. And of course 760. Again, intrapulmonary pressure we just indicated and stressed is what we find in the alveoli in the lungs, and that's 760 here. Intrapleural pressure in that pleural cavity. And then another term to know when it comes to pressure is the transpulmonary pressure. The transpulmonary pressure. So that ultimately is going to be the difference of the intrapulmonary pressure in the intrapleural pressure. And you can see that based off of the data here. So transpulmonary pressure, simply, we take the difference here of the intrapulmonary pressure of 760 minus the 756 from the intrapleural pressure, and you end up with a difference of 4 millimeters of mercury. So that's ultimately your difference here, is when you are breathing, inhalation, exhalation, there's an overall difference of +4, -4, okay? A difference of 4 units of pressure, okay? So 4 units of pressure. The purpose of the transpulmonary pressure, we can see it here, it's important. It keeps the air spaces of the lungs open and is important to prevent a lung collapse from occurring, okay? An atelectasis. So very, very key here. Pressure is very important. And we'll see very soon, what happens if the pressure changes and maybe even lung volume changing. So we'll be taking a look at that here real shortly. But definitely important to make sure to know these various terms of pressure. We're now going to take a look at the lung collapse. And the fancy term for that lung collapse, now we can see that here. It's known as the atelectasis, is referring to the lung collapse. There's several ways how a lung collapse can come about. Some people may have maybe really severe pneumonia. And with that, ultimately the bronchioles become plugged and leads to the collapse of the alveoli, and in turn leads to the lung collapse itself. So pneumonia is one major reason here. Also, a lung collapse can occur with a chest wound or even rupturing of the visceral pleura. So a chest wound, I have several examples here, maybe a gunshot wound to that thoracic cavity area, right? Or maybe it's a knife stabbing. It could be sports related where a lung collapse can occur, more of a contact sport, like I have hockey here. Broom ball, I used to play that in college. You're getting checked into the walls, the ice. Football, lacrosse, rugby, any of those types of sports, you get hit a certain way, you fall a certain way, and definitely can increase your possibility of a lung collapse occurring. And some people actually have spontaneous lung collapses that can take place. And sometimes that's just purely based off of anatomically how they're built. And sometimes that can happen, especially a lot of data shows with really, really tall men that are skinny, they have an increased chance based off of their anatomy. So, and then we can see in this picture here, the idea of the lung collapse. And we can see that here with the left lung. You can see that's collapsed significantly. It's obviously not blown up to its full extent like the right lung. So that gives you an idea what can happen here. So we look at the scenario, how we ultimately end up with the collapsed lung, the atelectasis. So imagine the situation here. Maybe someone did get a knife wound, okay? And here you can see that knife. And it punctures into that parietal pleura, into that pleural cavity area, okay? And when that happens, and there's an ultimate hole to the outside, and so you end up with a significant amount of air that can come in. And by doing so, this actually will change the pressure, because when you look at the overall pressure, typically, there's going to be a difference of 4 units of pressure between the intrapleural pressure and the intrapulmonary pressure, right? We can see that here. But again, with the knife wound, that hole to the outside, air is able to come in, and you end up with the chest wall expanding here. That's kind of what we're seeing here. The chest wall expands. In this case here, we're looking at the right side here, okay? The right lung. And ultimately then, with all that airflow coming in, chest wall expanding, that is going to go ahead and change the pressure internally. So now it's equalized, and the net result of that then can lead to the lung collapse. So we look at a new term here, and that's known as the pneumothorax. The pneumothorax. So that's referring to the presence of air in the pleural cavity and ultimately the chest wall expanding. Again, a knife wound, a bullet wound, something along those lines, this can happen. And so again, you have all of the significant air that can come in, and that leads to an indifference with the pressure. It can become equalized, no longer a difference of 4 units. And so because of that, the airflow coming in, the indifference with the pressure now equalized now, the chest wall is expanding and ultimately leads to the lung collapse that can occur. One interesting note is right over here that one lung can collapse, like we're seeing here with this right lung, without interfering with the function of the other lung. So that's definitely a possibility. So you have one lung that's doing fine here, the case on the left side here, and then the right lung, again, we can see that collapse that's occurred. So I'm sure all of us probably know someone who's had a lung collapse. I definitely had, I remember some friends in college, they were playing broom ball, and the one guy was out on the ice, little scrawny little guy, and a big, muscle builder, someone who lifts a significant amount of weights, rotund guy, like football player, came, checked the guy, got crushed into the boards, and that ultimately led to a lung collapse there on the ice for the poor guy. But he was okay. He was okay. He went to the hospital, and they were able to help him out. Another type I mentioned, you can see up here, this is the ruptured visceral pleura, typically at more of a spontaneous situation here. And so ultimately, the spontaneous situation can lead to the lung collapse as well. This picture here is showing ultimately the treatment involved if someone has that lung collapse, that atelectasis, okay? Of course, the hole from the knife stabbing or the bullet, again, all that air comes in, and that leads to more of an equalization of pressure, so that pneumothorax takes place. And ultimately, all that air we got to get out. You have the pneumothorax, and then the lung collapse, the atelectasis. So typically, one thing that can be utilized in more of a medical setting is chest tubes. So these chest tubes can be put into that pleural cavity area and ultimately can draw out the air out of that interpleural space. And again, that's what we're seeing here with this image here, to get rid of all that fluid, that air, and then eventually you have the pressure getting back to a difference of 4 units of pressure, and then ultimately in time the lung then will no longer be collapsed. It'll get back to its normal size, etc. Over here we have an X-ray image. This is kind of cool. This is someone who actually had a lung collapse, and here we have that lung here on the right side. Lung collapse occurred here with this lung. In contrast to the left side here, we can see a full lung right here. So the atelectasis lung collapse occurred here with the right lung. So kind of interesting here, this X-ray image kind of gives you a nice visual, I think. Moving on, there's a variety of different respiratory laws that we need to know. And the first one we're going to focus on here today is looking at what's known as Boyle's Law. Boyle's Law. And maybe some of you know this already if you're taking chemistry. They go through these laws in chemistry, in general chemistry. Or it might be completely new. Boyle's Law refers to a relationship between the pressure and the volume of a gas. One thing to note about Boyle's Law is the idea that pressure varies inversely with volume. Pressure varies inversely with volume. So if one increases, the other effect is the other then will decrease. Temperature will always be held constant in this situation. Here we have the formula for Boyle's Law. So we have here the P1 V1 equals P2 V2. What do these variables mean, right? So P1 is referring to the initial pressure that we would have per se in the lungs. V1 is referring to initial volume. So overall, the volume of air in the lungs. P2 referring to the final pressure. So maybe that increases or decreases. And V2 is the final volume of air that would be in the lungs. So we'll take a little bit more reviewing of this on our next slide as we'll focus in. I'll write out the equation and you get an idea. This gives you an idea more in a chemistry setting, but I think we'll have some better clarification on the next slide as we go through this together. So let's take a look at Boyle's Law here. All right, so Boyle's Law, again, that's P1 V1 is equal to P2 V2. And again, well, what do these variables mean, right? So the P1 is referring to that initial pressure. Okay? So initial pressure. The V1 is equal to the initial volume. And then P2 and V2. So P2 ultimately is referring to the final pressure. And then V2 ultimately is referring to the final volume. Okay, well, you're probably thinking, well, Chris, this still doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Well, let's go ahead and apply it to the respiratory system, and let's apply it to our lungs. Okay? So if we apply it to our lungs, and we think of this equation, the first half of the equation, let's consider that to be inhalation. Okay? So let's think of that inhalation, taking that deep breath, the inhale. Okay? So when you take that deep breath, okay? Taking a deep breath for you right now, and deep breath, what's happening? Well, take the deep breath, and there's going to be an increase in the volume, all right? So you have a deep increase in volume, big increase in overall volume, lung volume, and the effect, because these variables are inversely related, is there's actually then a drop in pressure in the lungs, okay? And so with that drop in pressure, that allows for that air to ultimately go down the trachea through the bronchial tree to the lungs. So those variables, volume and pressure, are inversely related. And that's the idea with inhalation. The other aspect of breathing, of course, is going to be the exhalation. So let's take a look at that here next. So we look at the idea of exhaling. Okay, the exhale. So when we look at the exhale, so first, of course, I have to inhale first for you. So I take my deep breath, take the air in, and blow out. So what happens then is you have this overall drop in volume, okay? You're blowing out the air, and in return, increase in pressure, okay? So that increase in pressure is taking place. You take the deep breath, you have all this air in your lungs, and then you blow it out, and that leads ultimately then to this increase in pressure, and the air can slip out, okay? So that's kind of how Boyle's law works. These variables are inversely related. So we'll go through this again. Very critical to know this. And that'll be the case with all the laws that we go through today. You got to know them. So, all right, lungs inhaling. So you take that deep breath, you have all this air in, and so you have ultimately this drop in pressure. So a drop in pressure, increase volume in the lungs, okay? Inversely related, inversely related. And then we look at exhalation. So again, you take that deep breath first, and then you blow out the air. And so by doing so, increase pressure, and decrease in volume as you're blowing out that air. So definitely make sure to study this. This is definitely very important to know Boyle's law. So I know you will. Definitely make sure to know this. Very, very key when it comes to quiz information, exam. So definitely make sure to review Boyle's law. Very, very important to review this concept. Very critical to know. Okay? Moving on, we take a look at what's happening in your body with the respiratory system when you're breathing, and looking at muscles involved, the bones involved around the vicinity of the lungs when you're inhaling and exhaling. So first we're going to focus in on what's taking place during the inhalation. All right, and again, this is all about Boyle's law here, right? When we talked about the idea of this overall, let's fix this here for you. We'll erase this here first. Okay. Right, so we had this decrease in pressure and increase in volume here that takes place. So again, the idea of Boyle's law, right? Boyle's law. And this is still a little too close here. We'll fix this. Nothing like being perfectionist, right? So we'll just do volume here first. So you have the increase in the volume, ultimately the drop in pressure. So that's the idea of what's happening here with the inhalation, inspiration. So we can see the sequence of events that's taking place here, right? So some of the big things that are taking place here in the sequence of events, you take that deep breath, right? And we look at, well, what's happening with your diaphragm, what's happening with your rib cage as you're taking in all this air, and ultimately pressure dropping. So when the inhalation is occurring, ultimately you take that deep breath and you'll find that your ribs become elevated, okay? So the rib cage becomes elevated. It's going to move up. And that's what this arrow is referring to, okay? So rib cage moving up, okay? So rib cage goes up. Also, your diaphragm, we focus in on that. The diaphragm moves in an inferior position. It's moving down, okay? So it's moving down the diaphragm. The rib cage is going to be elevated. The diaphragm moves down during the inhalation process. So something to think about, and maybe you can do some breathing activities right now as you're looking at this slide. But again, you take that deep breath and you can feel the rib cage going up. I can feel my diaphragm moving down as I'm breathing right now for you. But then there's also these external intercostal muscles we talked about, right? And those, again, are farther back. It's the internal intercostal muscles that are close to the sternum bone. The external intercostals are farther back. These muscles will contract as a part of that inhalation process. So think about that as you're going ahead and you're breathing, right? Again, you take that deep breath. Rib cage moves up, diaphragm down. And those external intercostal muscles are playing a role here with contraction. So that's really key here, okay? And so those are kind of the big three here to think about what's changing anatomically when you're doing the inhalation exhalation. So 1, 2, and 3. Pretty important to know those for sure. Now, if someone were to do more along the lines of a really forced inhalation, then sometimes there's additional muscles that are used. That's the case with the sternocleidomastoid and the pectoralis minor. So very, very forced inhalation. So maybe somebody is, I don't know, in a boat and they're out on the ocean, or maybe Lake Michigan or Lake Huron. Maybe they want to go snorkeling or something. And you take a really deep breath, before you go under. You know, you're snorkeling along, you're kicking along, and maybe you see some fish down, maybe 10 feet or something. You take a very, very deep forced breath, and then you go down there and, you know, you got your cell phone to take a picture of the fish, perhaps. And that forced type of breath, again, you're going to be using these additional muscles. You're going to be using that sternocleidomastoid muscle, okay? Which is along the side of the neck, of course. And you'll use the pectoralis minor. So those are additional muscles that will be utilized here. We look at the complete opposite effect of pulmonary ventilation, and now we're going to take a look at the idea of the exhalation. We've already looked at inhalation. Now we look at the exhalation. So again, we focus in on the changes occurring, especially with the diaphragm, the rib cage, and the external intercostal muscles, which we'll be looking at here shortly. Again, volume is going to drop here. And ultimately, with the volume dropping, pressure rises, right? So that gets back to the idea again of Boyle's law. So with the overall volume, so overall lung volume is going to decrease, and ultimately then pressure is going to be increasing. Again, Boyle's law, both of these variables are inversely related. And we take a look again at, well, what's happening during the exhalation, right? So first, of course, deep breath, and then blow out the air to exhale. During that time frame, the change is occurring. The ribs are depressed. The rib cage ultimately is moving down, right? It's moving down. That's a big thing. And then, of course, we look at the diaphragm. And the diaphragm actually is going to move up in the relaxation position. Okay, so that's something to feel. Inhale, exhale, and you can feel that diaphragm moving up in your body. So that's a big one here. And if I go back to number 2 then, right here, another biggie, of course, the external intercostal muscles relax during the exhalation. Okay, they're going to be in a relaxation mode. So those are the big 3 to think about during the exhalation. Again, the rib cage is depressed, moves down. External intercostal muscles are relaxing, okay? And the diaphragm is moving in a superior position. That's taking place during the exhalation. Now, once again, if someone's going to do a forced exhalation or expiration, there's additional muscles utilized. So your oblique muscles you might be using. So you might be using your internal obliques or external obliques, or maybe even your transverse abdominis muscles. So those muscles that are kind of the abs that you refer to, and the obliques, again, internal and external on the sides of your abdominal area. So those are additional muscles utilized during the exhalation. So definitely the case if someone's like hyperventilating, someone jumps into cold water and they're kind of spazzing and freaking out, they might be using those additional muscles right there. Because exhalation is typically significantly stronger than the inhalation during hyperventilation. So definitely make sure to review these 2 slides. Very important information to know here. All right, these graphs again, focus in on Boyle's law that we've been discussing so far today, right? So good old Boyle's law is what these graphs are referring to once again. So a very important law to know, Boyle's law, right? So very key to review that. And we can fix that a little bit there. The S didn't really come out entirely there. That's a little better. Boyle's law. So you can see again on the graph here, both pressure and volume are inversely related. This first half of the graph here, of course, is referring to the inhale. Once again here. So the inhalation. So you can see ultimately that pressure here is dropping. So that's what we're seeing here. And then down here for inhalation, of course, the volume is increasing. The other part of the graph here ultimately is showing you your exhale. So the changes in pressure and volume during the exhalation. That's what we're looking at here. So again, with pressure, we can see that we have an increase in pressure that's taking place here. And ultimately with volume, the volume is going down here. So inversely related, pressure and volume. Boyle's law, man. So definitely key to review this for sure. Here's a video that you can take a look at if you'd like. And this goes through the steps involved with looking at Boyle's law. So you're more than welcome to take a look at that video. I think you will enjoy it for review. So definitely take some time to take a look at it for sure. Definitely worth your while. I think you'll enjoy it for sure. We're now going to take a look at alveolar surface tension. So very important concept here. Alveolar surface tension. And we take a look at the chemical known as surfactant. So surfactant is a detergent-like lipid and protein complex, and it's produced by the type 2 cells, or also known as the type 2 alveolar cells. And the important purpose of the chemical surfactant is that it decreases surface tension of alveolar fluid and ultimately can discourage alveolar collapse. So this goes along with what's known as the infant respiratory distress syndrome, abbreviation of IRDS. And this happens to a lot of premature babies that are born, typically even up to month number 6. And so premature babies being born at month 6, which of course is extremely tiny, typically there's inadequate pulmonary surfactant produced. So there's several different treatments that can be utilized here. There are mechanical ventilators that can be used, and also natural or synthetic surfactant sprays. Now I think of myself, I went the full run. I was born 9 months, and I think I was even 2 weeks late for my actual birth date. So I was late. You know, I don't like change. You know, it's a new environment, change, you know. But my younger sister, though, totally different story. She actually came into this world at month number 6. And she was very small. Her lungs weren't totally developed yet. And so she actually had to stay in the hospital for approximately 2 months or so. And she was actually connected up to a ventilator. So that was the case with her anyway. And so maybe some of you were premature babies. Maybe you went the full length like me. So it really varies, and that's for sure. All right, the next concept we're going to take a look at here today is looking at lung compliance. Lung compliance. And lung compliance is looking at the change in lung volume that occurs with a given change in transpulmonary pressure. And here we have the equation down below here that you can see. So CL right here is referring to lung compliance. And here we have lung volume here, a change in lung volume, and the triangle is referring to change. So delta refers to change, divided by a change in pressure. In this case, referring to the transpulmonary pressure, and that is a difference of the intrapulmonary pressure minus the intrapleural pressure. So to take a look at lung compliance, we ultimately can take a look at the graph here. And to develop a graph that you can see here, you ultimately can blow into a spirometer machine, and you'll see some pictures of that really soon. But that's a very important device for a measurement of how healthy your lungs really are. So down here, we have our overall x-axis here. So this is the transpulmonary pressure here. Our y-axis shows the vital capacity. And the vital capacity ultimately is taking into effect your inhalation, your exhalation, air that is ultimately still in your lungs. So it's taking in a lot of different overall measurements of breathing. But when you're breathing into that spirometer machine, you'll get different curves. So we can see here, this is a normal curve in the middle. Okay, this is a normal curve you would develop right here in the graph. This is a normal curve. Okay, and TLC, if you're wondering what that means, the TLC, right here, TLC, that refers to total lung capacity. So that's what the TLC is referring to, total lung capacity. Okay? So this would be a normal graph that you would develop. Now, if we take a look at the lower graph here, you see that the graph is significantly lower and a very low TLC, very low lung compliance. So this would be the case with certain pulmonary diseases, the case with the condition known as fibrosis, where the lungs become very, very stiff. And this is something that can happen to a lot of individuals that are maybe their occupation's coal mining. So you think of coal miners that might be in West Virginia or Kentucky or Pennsylvania. And over time, a lot of damage can happen to the lungs, the stiffening of them. It's going to lead to a very huge decrease in total lung capacity, a big decrease in inhalation and exhalation. So then it's really difficult for them to get air into their lungs and out. Very, very, very tough there. So very big there. And then some individuals, they'll breathe into a spirometer and they potentially might have a really high TLC, so high lung compliance. So that's the case with more of obstructive pulmonary diseases. Okay, so that's a great example. That would be emphysema. Emphysema. So that's emphysema is one part of COPD, a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And so you end up with patients with high lung compliance. So what happens here? You'd think, well, that should be lower, right? The person that developed the emphysema from breathing in pollutants in the air from an industrial factory or smoking up cigarettes. But what it is that they're inhaling at a very high rate. But the thing is then, when it comes to actual gas exchange down at the molecular level of the alveoli and pulmonary capillaries, that overall rate's pretty slow. And then there's that loss of elastic recoiling of the lungs. So the inflating is significantly high, the inflating of the lungs, and then the deflating is very damaged significantly. So it's very tough for them to go through the exhalation process. So typically you see patients with emphysema, they have a big chest, kind of like a chest barrel type of syndrome, because it's very tough for them to get the air out. And so with their inhalation rates are so high, it actually ends up being that the TLC is higher than someone who's normal. So they have a really tough time with those lungs properly deflating, the loss of elastic recoiling of the lungs, very hard to get rid of that CO2. So very tough in that regard. So, okay, so it's important to know examples of high lung compliance, low lung compliance. We can see that with emphysema here, with high lung compliance, someone more with an obstructive type of pulmonary disease, and normal right here for the lung compliance, and then low lung compliance, lungs are stiffened significantly. TLC is very, very low, and the type of pulmonary disease here would be more along the restrictive line, so restrictive pulmonary disease versus obstructive. Okay, so definitely review lung compliance, a very important concept to know. We now take a look at different types of pulmonary function tests. And like the previous graph we saw with lung compliance, typically a spirometer is a machine that's usually used. So a respiratory therapist would be using this type of machine. So very important, this type of machine, this instrument, to measure respiratory volumes and capacities. Very important to look, well, does this patient have an actual respiratory disease or not? Is there a loss of respiratory function? So a very important tool that can be utilized in the lab. Again, an obstructive pulmonary type of disease, like we mentioned already, this would be the patient that has the very high lung compliance CL, right? So CL referring to overall lung compliance. Again, my handwriting's not the best, so we can fix that here for you. So the overall high lung compliance here, okay? And huge increase airway resistance here. Again, someone with emphysema, okay, chronic bronchitis. Those are two parts to the COPD. And ultimately here, the lungs are hyperinflating. Okay, they're hyperinflating. So again, inhalation is significantly higher in that regard. The issue is the exhalation at the end. The other part here, when we think of different respiratory diseases, is more along the lines of the restrictive type of pulmonary disease. So here there's a reduction in the total TLC, okay? And this is due to structural or functional lung changes, the case with fibrosis that we mentioned, but also tuberculosis would be another great example. And here, the lung expansion has been limited significantly. The lungs are stiffened, and they end up with a very low TLC. And also, when we think about this, they would have a very low lung compliance as well. So, a very low lung compliance here. So, we'll fix that here for you here. So, low lung compliance and likewise low TLC. Again, obstructive pulmonary disease, high lung compliance, and likewise high TLC, total lung capacity. And I should mention too on the slide that you can also see various instruments here which are different types of spirometers. This is one more in an educational setting that would be utilized. So this would be one used in our classroom, a nice $40 spirometer. You have your mouthpiece, you'd have a nose piece on, and then you'd actually breathe into that spirometer. And again, you'll get various forms of data, different capacities and volumes. This is one that obviously is a little bit more costly, thousands of dollars here. So something more along the lines in a medical setting that you would get. All right, this graph is really important. This is showing you the spirometer reading that you would get off in a graph. This is something that you would generate, again, when you go to the hospital, you go to the respiratory therapist. But this type of graph could be generated in an educational setting too. This is something that we generate in our classroom when we do our respiratory physiology labs. So let's take a look here. When you develop this graph, you'll see that these various items are either going to be known as a volume or a capacity. So a volume is defined as a quantity of air that cannot be subdivided into smaller quantities. And that's the idea of a volume. It's pretty much just focusing on a single overall data piece. And then we look at a capacity. You'll see some of those on this graph here. This is looking at a quantity of air that is made up of 2 or more volumes. So you have a couple pieces of data that you combine together to form a capacity. So you end up with a larger type of data piece. And all of this is recorded in milliliters. So you can see that over here on the y-axis, milliliters here. So we break down, what do these various pieces mean, right? Well, let's start here in the middle, tidal volume. Tidal volume right here. And tidal volume, what that ultimately is referring to, tidal volume, TV for an abbreviation, is breathing under resting conditions. So you're not straining yourself. You're not, exercising hard, breathing hard here. This is just resting conditions, the tidal volume. So a nice resting inhalation, exhalation here. So maybe if you're relaxing at home, chilling at home, that would be the idea of the tidal volume ultimately. Okay. All right. So the tidal volume would be like this piece here on the graph, would be the idea of tidal volume. Another piece of data here is what's known as the inspiratory reserve volume. That's sometimes abbreviated here as the IRV, so forcefully inhaled air. So when you're taking a very, very deep breath. So that would be the case here on the graph, this area of the graph here. So this would represent your IRV right here on the graph, okay? And down here, this would be an example of your TV, tidal volume on the graph here. Okay? So we can make this a little easier to read here. We can erase this here. And again, this is the tidal volume. This one little piece here or one little piece here would be TV tidal volume. Okay? We also have in the graph what's known as the expiratory reserve volume, abbreviated as your ERV. So on the graph, it would be this area down here. This represents your ERV, okay? So your ERV on the graph, right up here, ERV. So that's when you're taking a very forceful exhalation. You take the deep breath first, and then you force the air out. That's the idea of the expiratory reserve volume. And then another volume piece here is what's known as the residual volume. Residual volume. So residual volume, RV. So that here you can see is the amount of air remaining in your lungs. There's always some air that's always left in your lungs no matter what. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind. Those are all volumes. Now, if you start to combine the volumes together, let's say you combine your IRV, your TV, and ERV, then you have what's known as vital capacity. So I've mentioned that before, vital capacity. So again, that incorporates IRV, TV, and ERV. And then if you were to also incorporate residual volume, then we look at total lung capacity. And again, these are the types of data pieces that you can get when you breathe into a spirometer machine, when you go and see a respiratory therapist. And this is something we can generate in the lab here right at Delta College too. Other types of data that you can collect when it comes to pulmonary function test, you can see here on this graph. So we look at what's known here. So again, we're reviewing some data pieces here. Forced vital capacity, FVC. And this is when ultimately gas is being forcibly expelled, taking a very deep breath. So you take a very, very deep breath, really big inhalation, and then exhalation, where you're literally feeling like blowing out all the air. You have no air left in your body, and then typically you follow that up by an inhalation. So it would be an inhale, exhale, inhale here. And this can be done likewise with a spirometer. So that's one data piece, this forced vital capacity, FVC. Another piece of data you can get here is your FEV1 value. So your forced expiratory volume. This is the amount of gas expelled in 1 second. And this can be a good measurement if your lungs are healthy, is looking at the data piece, that FEV1 value. And so healthy lungs can exhale 80% of the FVC within a second. So these data pieces definitely are important to note. So this is looking here at the FEV1 value, and FVC would be right here. And again, this is using a spirometer machine to do that. And again, typically, if we looked at this graph as a whole, it would actually round about like this to generate this graph. And you'd start off, the inhalation would be over here. So you'd inhale, taking that real deep breath here. And then ultimately down over here would be the exhale. So inhale, exhale, and then inhale down here. And we do a lab like this in our classroom with the spirometer machine. Of course, you need maximum effort, so that way, you get the data that you need. And again, using that spirometer machine, you have a mouthpiece on the spirometer, you have your nose piece on, and you're doing that deep inhalation, exhalation, followed up by another inhale. And this picture right here is actually a really old school device here, where you actually have old graphing paper with a pencil, which can actually give you your data. So yeah, crazy. All right, we've come to our next law we're going to look at in here today, which is looking at Dalton's law. So Dalton's law of partial pressures. So this is referring to total pressure that's going to be exerted or applied by a mixture of gases is the sum of the pressures exerted or applied by each gas, which probably sounds like a mouthful. And this is another type of law that's typically reviewed in general chemistry. All right, so the equation you can see here, P equals P1 plus P2 plus P3. And so we look at, well, what does this mean? P is equal to the total pressure. P1, P2, P3 are the partial pressures of gases. And ultimately then, this is looking at the gases in the atmosphere. So when we look at the gases in the atmosphere, there's oxygen, there's carbon dioxide, there's nitrogen, and they all have a certain percentage. And ultimately, those partial pressures then round up to 100%. So when you think about these different gases in the air, sorry to say, you're not breathing in 100% pure oxygen. It's a partial pressure of these gases, a partial pressure of oxygen, a partial pressure of CO2, a partial pressure of nitrogen. And so that's what we're looking at here. So this symbol here, the P, that's referring to the partial pressure of oxygen, O2 oxygen. And here, PCO2, a partial pressure of carbon dioxide gas. And then again, if we're looking at nitrogen gas, that would be the PN2 here. So that's the key. When you're breathing in, you're taking in the air through inhalation, it's partial pressures of these gases that are actually going through your body. That's actually going through the different parts of your respiratory system. And eventually these gases moving through your entire cardiovascular system and arteries and veins and capillaries. It's partial pressures of these gases ultimately. And that's the idea of Dalton's law. So we'll take a look at this and a little bit more clarification here on the next slide. All right, so now let's take a look at Dalton's law here, and we'll get some clarification to break this down for you. So I'm going to write out the equation again. So we have P equals P1 plus P2 plus P3, and so on and so forth. Remember that the P is referring to total pressure. So total pressure. And P1, P2, and P3 ultimately here are referring to your partial pressures. So partial pressures. So partial pressures here, when we think of our gases. All right, so when we think of these partial pressures of gases, we're thinking again of gases in the atmosphere because, sorry to tell you, but you're not actually breathing in 100% pure oxygen. It's a percentage of gases that are in the atmosphere. And so this is typically represented by this capital P. So we have partial pressure of oxygen, so that could be P1. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide gas, so capital P, and then you have CO2. And then partial pressure of nitrogen, so N2. So in the atmosphere then, when it comes to the percentages, oxygen, believe it or not, and maybe you know the percentage, maybe not, you could take a guess, but it's going to be roughly 20.9%. That is the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere, is 20.9%. When it comes to carbon dioxide gas, this percentage is significantly lower. It's at 0.04%. So that's extremely low for the amount of CO2. And nitrogen, believe it or not, has the highest percentage in the atmosphere. So nitrogen is approximately at 78.6%. So those are the big three for gases. And then there's smaller gases in the atmosphere too, like argon, but you don't really need to worry about that. Okay? So oxygen is 20.9%. Carbon dioxide, the percentage in the atmosphere is 0.04%. And nitrogen gas stands at 78.6%. So that's the percentage of these gases that we're breathing in, taking into our bodies. That's the idea here of these partial pressures. And together, you put them together, and ultimately that percentage would be 100. And that's the idea of total pressure. So that's the big thing to get out of this law. Again, when you're breathing, okay, you take a breath, inhaling, it's going to be these partial pressures of the gases that are coming through our respiratory system, and ultimately these gases going through our cardiovascular system and going through our arteries and going through our veins and etc. Okay, so that's the big thing to get out of this for sure. All right, so going off of this idea of partial pressures of gases, here we're focusing in on the partial pressures of oxygen and CO2. And this figure ultimately is focusing on that. So we have our PO2, partial pressure of oxygen, and our PCO2, partial pressure of carbon dioxide. All right, so we first look at what these levels are at for our gases, oxygen and CO2, when you're taking that deep breath. So the idea of inspired air. So when you take that inhalation, that deep breath, your partial pressure of oxygen will be a lot higher. In this case, we're seeing a level of 160 millimeters of mercury, and then CO2 is significantly lower at 0.3, which makes sense. And then ultimately that goes through your respiratory system, and you eventually get down to the level of the alveoli, and now that level of oxygen is at 104, and carbon dioxide is at 40. Now the reason why it's at 40 CO2, why it's increased a lot, is because of the buildup of CO2 that has taken place in your tissue cells. And that's the level of, at the alveoli prior to you eventually going ahead and exhaling and releasing the air. You notice that the oxygen did drop a little bit. Sometimes the differences in humidity levels, so that type of thing. Now eventually we think of overall the gases are in the blood and blood flow, and eventually we get down to the level of the tissues. So we'll just go down here now. So now we're at the level of the tissues. And at the level of the tissues, again, when you think of an artery, right? An arterial end and a venous end, you're going to have a lot of the oxygen then that was on that oxygen-rich blood side of the capillary, the arterial end, and the oxygen dumped off to the tissue cells. And then in return, you have carbon dioxide gas that leaves the tissue cells and goes back into that artery. So the level of the tissues, then, carbon dioxide partial pressure will be greater than 55 millimeters of mercury, and oxygen will be less than 40. Again, that's all about the amount of oxygen dumped off to the tissues and the amount of CO2 that was accumulating in the tissues going back into that artery on that venous end. And of course, there's other things that play a role with this idea. Obviously doing a lot of aerobic exercise, running and swimming and biking and cross-country skiing and so on and so forth. That aerobic activity, there'll be a big demand for oxygen for your muscles to do the activities. So a lot more oxygen could be being dumped off, and CO2 levels end up staying high, and they will on the venous end versus the arterial end of blood flow. And then we can see here blood leaving the tissues, ultimately then entering into the lungs. The CO2 levels will be higher than the oxygen. And then ultimately, you take that deep breath, and through exhalation then, you release that oxygen, that CO2, and in return, again, oxygen levels will be higher, in the case here with inspired air. What we're also seeing is gas exchange occurring at two major locations, and we'll get into that a little later. But there's two forms of respiration you can see here. There's external respiration and the idea of the internal respiration. And external respiration is gas exchange occurring at the level of the lungs. So that's referring to the gas exchange occurring between the level of the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. And that's the idea of external respiration. External, you think of an opening. For me, there's the opening of the mouth and the nose. And then the idea of internal respiration, here we have gas exchange of oxygen and CO2 occurring at the level of the tissues. So movement of the gases between tissue cells and likewise capillaries nearby. All right, this image here, you're probably wondering, oh my gosh, what's happening here? But this is ultimately looking at how your oxygen levels can change very fast when we're looking at the pulmonary capillary. So down here, the x-axis is looking at the overall time in the pulmonary capillary of oxygen, and ultimately here the y-axis is looking at partial pressure of oxygen. And so early on, again, your partial pressure of oxygen is at a very low level of 40. But within a very short period of time, less than a second here, 0.25 seconds, you take that deep breath of inhalation, right? And you go from a level of 40 for the partial pressure of oxygen all the way up to 104 in the alveoli here. between the alveoli and pulmonary capillaries. So it's a pretty quick process here to get that oxygen in to your body. All right, the next law we're going to take a look at in here today is looking at Fick's law. So Fick's law looks at the rate of transfer of a gas through a sheet of tissue is proportional to the tissue area and the difference in gas partial pressures between the two sides, and inversely proportional to the tissue thickness. Which I'm sure you're thinking is, oh boy, Chris, this is a mouthful. All right, here's our equation. So V gas, this is referring to your overall gas flow rates, is equal to A over T times D times P1 minus P2. And A is referring to the area, surface area available. T is referring to the thickness. P1 and P2, the partial pressure of the gas. So in this case, referring to like oxygen or carbon dioxide. And D is a diffusion constant. So of course, gas is moving because of simple diffusion. And this law really looks at gas flow rates happening within an alveolus, going from the alveolus to a pulmonary capillary. So we'll break this down a little bit more on the next slide. And again, with a lot of these laws, a lot of critical thinking, clinical types of questions can be utilized when we think of a lot of these laws. Okay, looking at Fick's law, we're going to break this down here for you today. So I'm going to write the equation here on the board here for you for Fick's law. So we have V gas equals A over T times D times P1 minus P2 in parentheses. So what do these things really mean, right? So V gas, that is referring to the actual gas flow rates, referring to the gas flow rates. How fast is the gas actually moving between an alveolus and the pulmonary capillaries? All right, letter A is referring to surface area. What type of surface area do we have for the transferring of the gases? So surface area, pretty important to have surface area. T, the T is referring to thickness. How thick is the wall layer within the alveolus? So thickness. D is referring to diffusion, so it's a diffusion constant, so really focusing in on this idea of simple diffusion. And we can fix that here for you. Okay, so simple diffusion. So simple diffusion here, again, the way the gases travels through simple diffusion. Again, this is considered a constant. So your simple diffusion constant and P1 minus P2 is referring to the partial pressures of the gases here. So we'll write this here on the board here for you. Your partial pressure of the gases. And again, here we're looking at our focus being partial pressure of oxygen, right? And partial pressure of carbon dioxide gas, CO2. When we think of those two concepts there. So to really capture this law, let's say I go ahead and make a little picture here, right? Because I'm so skilled with my artistic ability. And let's imagine that what I'm drawing here, let's say it's an alveolus, right? Because again, those were those tiny little like marshmallows I would refer to. When we learned about those in the model, and this is where gas exchange occurs, is within the alveolus. And the movement of the gases, remember there are two types of cells, type 1 and type 2. The type here that we're focusing on with gas exchange and movement would be the type 1 cells here, okay? The type 1 cells. Right? And so let's say we have some of these type 1 cells throughout the alveolus here. And ultimately with these type 1 cells, you have your membrane here, right? Your overall respiratory membrane. And when we think of these type 1 cells within the alveolus, so our respiratory membrane here. And we'll fix this here for you. There we go. All right. So here we have it, our respiratory membrane. Lovely. So how can we use this and apply this? Well, it definitely can come into handy when we think of different pulmonary types of diseases, right? So if someone were to have like maybe severe pneumonia or something, let's say someone has severe pneumonia, there's a big increase in the thickness of the membrane of type 1 cells. So you get a lot of edema and fluid buildup. Ultimately, you must ask yourself, well, if you have all this thickness, an increase in thickness in the membrane here of type 1 cells and edema buildup and fluid with someone with severe pneumonia, ultimately, then the gas flow rates would go down, right? So those are the types of things to think about when you're applying Fick's law. A lot of critical thinking types of questions can come from this when we think of different respiratory diseases. All right, so that's kind of the idea of Fick's law there. All right, so here are some review questions, and this can really help. Again, critical thinking questions related to a lot of the laws that we've covered so far in our respiratory physiology. All right, question number 1 for review. You have a patient that has pneumonia. Excessive amounts of edema is increasing the thickness of the respiratory membrane in the alveoli. What will happen to the gas flow rates in this patient? So what do you think would happen here? Did I just mention that in the previous slide, something similar? Perhaps. So what would be the correct answer here? The correct answer, I hope you went with it, is that gas flow rates would decrease, right? Because, again, you have the patient with severe pneumonia. Again, that's the case with someone who has COVID, right? When it gets really bad, you get that pneumonia in the lungs, and gas flow rates would decline. So there'd be a slowdown in the movement of oxygen, right? And a huge increase with thickness in the respiratory membrane of the alveoli. So that's the case there. This would also be the case, of course, with someone who has congestive heart failure left side, where they have a lot of edema buildup too. Number 2 for review, again, focusing on Fick's law. So let's suppose you have a patient that has emphysema due to years of cigarette chain smoking. This ultimately has led to a destruction of the alveolar surface area, deep in the lung tissue. What has happened to the flow rates in this patient? What has happened to the flow rates in this patient? So what would be the correct answer here? Okay, so based off of these choices, I would go with ultimately letter C. So letter C, the gas flow rates would decline. Okay? Because again, we're not talking about lung compliance here. Remember, we're talking about lung compliance. We mentioned emphysema, some with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, that ultimately their TLCs would increase. Here, we're simply just looking at how fast the gas is actually moving. And that's the case between the alveolus and pulmonary capillaries. So surface area would be broken down, destroyed, right? So there'd be less surface area here. You have less surface area, and that ultimately can lead to a decline in the gas flow rate. Number 3 for review. This is looking at Boyle's law. Remember, we talked about Boyle's law. So during inhalation, the lung volume would blank as the intrapulmonary pressure will blank. So what would be the correct answer here? What would be the correct answer here? All right. So considering ultimately inhalation, the correct answer should be choice letter D. Increases and decreases. So lung volume would go up during inhalation and pressure falls, as they are inversely related. Number 4 for review. Which of the following processes take place during exhalation? Which of the following processes take place during exhalation? So, what would be the correct answer here? What would be the correct answer here? All right, and the correct answer would be choice letter D. Both A and B would be correct. It's certainly true that the rib sternum vicinity, the rib cage, would be depressed, and certainly true the diaphragm would move up during exhalation. But letter C is not true. External intercostal muscles contract. Well, that's during inhalation. So if you were to cross that out and put relax, that would be true then. Okay? So very important to review this concept of inhalation, exhalation. What's happening to the rib cage? What's happening to the diaphragm? What's happening to the external intercostal muscles? So here the correct answer is letter D. Number 5. When someone receives a gunshot wound past the thoracic wall to the visceral pleura, this leads to a what? So what would be the correct answer here based off these choices? All right, and the correct answer here, I would go with choice letter C. Both A and B would be correct. Okay, so first the patient would have the pneumothorax. The air comes in, and that's going to lead to that chest wall expanding, the pressure changes from that difference of 4 units to it's equalized, and that ultimately leads to the effect of the atelectasis. So pneumothorax happens, then the lung collapse, atelectasis. So that's kind of how that works. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the respiratory physiology today. And so we'll continue on with this part 2 at a later date.